History is boring, yes, but why? Because it is long and elusive? We do not complain that great rivers never cease to flow. Is it because economics is so dry and mind-numbing? Perhaps. But perhaps the real lesson is that rich and powerful people have done so deliberately to put you to sleep. Deliberately, so you'll never understand what they're doing to you.
Part 4. The Civil War Years. 1820 to 1860 are considered the antebellum years, the years the United States came of age. During these years, the nation was transformed from an underdeveloped nation of farmers and frontiersmen into an urbanized economic powerhouse. As the industrialized North and the agricultural South grew further apart, westward expansion brought fierce debate over expansion of slavery, especially in the cases of Texas and Missouri. The Industrial Revolution made the U.S. the leading world power by the end of the century, but the agricultural Deep South was left behind by this progress. In 1844, the Bank Charter Act was granted by the Bank of England, which gave sole rights to issue banknotes, tied in turn to gold reserves held in due proportion. These special new powers further centralized the bank ahead of the Civil War. In 1846, the U.S. had a war with Mexico, which was tied to a lot of the same bullshit.
Oh, not again.
Three years later sees 1849, an iconic year when Americans were lured further into the extremities of the West on the promise, or rather lust, for gold, in the California Gold Rush. Gold dust fever brought many miners, panners, and pioneers generally. In turn, discoveries of new gold in California and Australia flooded London gold markets in the 1850s, which the Rothschilds nearly monopolized and could easily manipulate for good or ill.
There's a good old-fashioned word for people like us. We call them suckers. And there are other people who stay up nights figuring out how to take away what they've got.
As you see, the top hat is still worn, but today only by a few.
We are at a historic turning point.
Money as debt is a form of slavery. It's changed everything.
Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank.
I don't hang around trying to read the entrails of what some statement in the administration may say, because it's our responsibility to make up our mind about these things.
There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily hiding hundreds of miles south.
A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control, and also we will have the technology to enforce that.
It's a secret meeting at the time. They told nobody about it. The details came out later, but this is the place where the most important people in the world first came up with a formal plan to create the Federal Reserve.
This place is crazy.
I have alleged that there is a money trust.
Better for the state relative to cash.
Hi, welcome to Jekyll Island. To begin, first make a selection at the top. Second, please ensure cash on the left or credit card on the right.
We have mineral deposits beyond belief.
During the 1850s, the discovery of new gold in California and Australia poured new gold supply into London markets. Markets which the Rothschild banks admittedly held under near monopoly and could easily manipulate, for good or ill. In fact, the World Gold Council marks 1850 as the, quote, watershed year for gold, as the year when gold production dramatically expanded tenfold, when the precious metal became the de facto international gold standard in every major country save China. Until this point, only Britain had a true gold standard, thanks to a more or less random determination by Sir Isaac Newton under his role as Master of the Mint circa 1717.
The Compromise of 1850 was an agreement to disagree.
The Compromise of 1850. Senators Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas broker a shaky accord admitting California as a free state, but leaving the rest of the Mexican cessation a shady, unregulated zone of slavery. It also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled Northerners to capture and return escaped slaves back to slave states. Meanwhile, historians mark 1850 in London as a point when a gentlemanly capitalism composed of white-collar financiers, shippers, and insurers provided the real drivers for economic growth in the empire. By the 1860s, historians mark the internationalization of the discount market, but we'll just call it cheaper by the dozen on a global scale. In 1851, the Kansas-Nebraska Act brings slave state issues further to a head, as the lead up to the Civil War continues to build. Again, I just want to mention again, one more time, that all the mercury that Nathan Rothschild had secured from the Almaden mines back in the 1830s became invaluable to all of the gold and silver that Rothschild and Sons began refining for the Bank of England and the Royal Mint in 1852. So, using mercury to make gold. I mean, we're talking literal alchemy here. In 1853, the Bank of England issued its first fully printed and fully transferable notes, a public paper money system for England that the public was initially skeptical of. Gee, I can't imagine why. 1854 marked the creation of the Republican Party, aka the Grand Old Party, the GOP, a new party which appealed especially to young voters in the North, which created wide-awake coalitions, which campaigned on a national banking system, high tariffs, a gold standard, the expansion of railroads, but was most notorious for promoting abolition. 1854 to 1859 was the bleeding Kansas mini-Civil War, which epitomized the violent confrontations between free staters and pro-slavery settlers in new western states. The Pottawatomie Creek Massacre occurred in May 1856, when radical abolitionist John Brown, set on instigating war, led an anti-slavery gang on a killing spree, hacking 5 pro-slavery settlers to death, an attempt at repelling the expansion of slavery with open violence.
And at Harper's Ferry, right where the valleys meet, a grave and tragic conflict springs to life.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood.
In 1859, the same John Brown led the failed raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia, attempting to incite an all-out slave revolt. Brown was captured, charged, and tried for treason, insurrection, and murder, and publicly hanged. Ironically, the first person Brown's men killed in the raid on Harper's Ferry was a free black man named Hayward Shepherd. At the time, Southern papers decried Brown as a fanatical militant lunatic who went around indiscriminately killing people in cold blood, and thus justice was served, while newspapers in the North published ballads in Brown's honor and compared his gallows to the cross of Jesus Christ. Although Brown's raids didn't lead to the slave uprising he sought, the intense publicity surrounding his trial and execution served to escalate tensions between the North and South that led to the long-threatened secession of Southern states and ultimately the American Civil War. It should be noted on the brink of the Civil War, November 24, 1859, that Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species with the help of Royal Society President T.H. Huxley, setting the stage for the scientific management of mankind to come. As of 1860, the North accounted for 90% of U.S. manufacturing as well as banking, with more than a quarter of its population living in urban city life. As of this same year, the economic value of slaves in the United States exceeded the invested value of all of the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined. On the eve of the Civil War, cotton prices were at an all-time high. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and Southern states began to drop like flies. South Carolina seceded first on December 20th, and the first 7 Confederate states began to form a government by February 4, 1861, just a month before Lincoln's inauguration, which was surrounded by warnings of conspiracy and assassination. Loans for the coming Civil War were increasingly secured with cotton bonds issued in Europe, debt to be repaid and agreed-upon cotton exports to England and France. The importance of cotton produced with slave labor made the Confederate leaders confident of the financial, diplomatic, and military assistance they needed for victory. On April 12, 1861, the Confederates fired upon Fort Sumter, officially beginning the Civil War.
Deadly struggle between two ways of life.
November 8, 1861 saw the Trent Affair. The USS San Jacinto under Captain Wilkes, a decedent of the famed English liberty icon John Wilkes, who later became an outlaw MP and then Lord Mayor of London, and likewise related to John Wilkes Booth, controversially captured 2 Confederate envoys as contraband in contradiction to maritime protocol. The British government protested vigorously, and the British press raised speculation about entry into the war. However, the U.S. released the Confederate envoys and ended the incident. The Confederate passengers, James Murray Mason and John Slidell, were sailing aboard a British Royal Mail steamer and headed to England and France respectively in a failed bid to secure diplomatic recognition and support. However, Slidell did succeed in gaining a $15 million loan from Parisian banker Baron Émile d'Allenger, who just so happened to marry Slidell's daughter, Matilda. Allenger, a former Rothschild employee who opened his own competing firm, issued cotton bonds in 1863 to support the Confederacy, and afterwards was heavily invested in Southern railroads and the Reconstruction economy. Throughout the Civil War, private British ships broke blockade to send arms, munitions, and other supplies in exchange for cotton and tobacco at Southern Confederate ports. Manchester, England, whose economy was dependent upon textiles made of cotton, plummeted into economic disaster. To avert it, its industry players sponsored multiple Confederate warships, including the CSS Alabama, built in 1862, memorialized in the folk song Roll, Alabama, Roll. In the midst of the Trent Affair came an account about the Rothschilds that was rather reminiscent of their Waterloo triumph. Though the Mason and Slidell issue was quelled within a few days, the Rothschilds apparently took such advantage of the capricious markets during the interim period that a scandal erupted. On January 29, 1862, American newspapers accused the London Times, owned in part by the Rothschilds, of abusing its powers by deliberately misreporting. Quote, "We remember few instances where the rightful power of the press has been prostituted to a worse purpose than was the case with the capture by Captain Wilkes of Mason and Slidell." The Rothschilds principally owned the London Times. They wished to lower the price of British funds. They consequently set the Times to thundering about a war within the United States. The funds suddenly dropped down 3 or 4%. The Rothschilds then buy up, by their agents, 10 to 20 million pounds sterling. And then, before our reply to the British demand for the surrender of Slidell and Mason was known in England, British funds were permitted to return to their original place, and the Rothschilds pocket an immense sum in a few days. Thus, a very privileged timing of information. While ordinary readers were digesting news that, quote, fluctuated in the most uncertain way, thus misdirecting speculators, the Rothschilds allegedly received a private dispatch assuring them that Mason and Slidell would be given up. Other financiers, believing public accounts, lost substantial sums. And that is how it works. Rep. Thaddeus Stevens, a House Republican and chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, was perhaps a leading advocate in Congress for debt-free greenbacks backed by direct credit of the government. He warned in his February 20, 1862 floor speech that the currency plan was weakened by the Senate, who revised the bill to define paper money as legal tender for all purposes except duties on imports and interest on the public debt. a significant exception said to be added at the direction of the bankers. Rep. Stevens decried this undermining of debt-free money, stating,
"I have a melancholy foreboding that we are about to consummate a cunningly devised scheme which will carry great injury and great loss to all classes of people throughout this Union except one. It is true, there was a doleful sound from the caverns of bullion brokers and from the associated banks. Their agents were soon on the ground and persuaded the Senate, with but little deliberation, to mangle and destroy, and so disfigured and deformed it that its father would not know it. Instead of being a beneficent and invigorating measure, it is positively mischievous. It now creates money, and by its very terms, declares it a depreciated currency. It makes two classes of money, one for banks and brokers and another for the people. It discriminates by allowing the capitalists to demand gold and compelling the ordinary lender to receive notes which the government has purposely discredited. All classes of people shall take these legal tender notes at par for every article of trade or contract, unless they have enough money to buy United States bonds, and then they shall be paid in gold. Who is that favored class? The banks and brokers, and nobody else."
Lincoln signed the Legal Tender Act of 1862 to issue some $150 million in greenbacks, paper notes issued and to be accepted in lieu of gold and silver coin. That same year, the Pacific Railroad Act was passed, and the Internal Revenue Service was created on July 1st. August 22, 1862, news is published of an attempted assassination of Baron Rothschild. A man named Charles Reynolds, alias Charles Davis, employed as a draper, was charged with sending threatening letters to Sir Anthony Rothschild and his brothers Baron Mayer and Baron Lionel Rothschild. On a side note, his name makes a very pertinent anagram for the time. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, effectively ending slavery.
"And among them is the President. He looks older now, seldom smiles. War has been so long, so many dead on both sides." After a while, after the main speaker, he has a few words to say.
"47 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure."
At the time the National Currency Act was signed, on February 25, 1863, there were more than 10,000 different varieties of paper money, many of which were discounted in value when exchanged for gold, silver, or usable merchandise.
Opposed by Thaddeus Stevens, the National Currency Act of 1863 and the supplementary 1864 National Banking Act overhaul officially put the U.S. government back into banking for the first time since Jackson's mortal wound to the Second Bank of the U.S. In the midst of the Civil War, the federal government now created the confusingly named First National Bank in Philadelphia, which became the first private commercial bank authorized to issue federal banknotes, in part designed to accommodate swelling federal war loans. The bank is considered the foundation of the U.S. banking system and precursor to the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, and effectively taxed state banks out of competition.
"That our nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from
of the earth.
Two former graduates of West Point meet in a small house in a town called Appomattox. And Ulysses S. Grant, whose initials stand for unconditional surrender, converses at length with Robert E. Lee, who hopes for something better than unconditional surrender.
On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General and future President Ulysses S. Grant. A de facto end to the Civil War. Just 3 days after the war ended, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln at Ford's Theater while he was watching Our American Cousin, a play about a socially unrefined American claiming his heritage in a large estate among aristocratic English society. Isn't it ironic? Don't you think?
It's like rain.
No, just kidding. It should again be noted that just after the Civil War ended in June 1865, first cousin to Charles Darwin, English polymath Francis Galton, first formulated eugenics, the pseudo-scientific policy increasingly adopted by Western governments to promote elite Anglo breeding, and further justify the widespread use of forced sterilizations and other anti-fertility measures among derisive air quotes genetically unfit individuals, often from targeted minority populations. On March 12, 1866, recommendations by Secretary of the Treasury Hugh McCulloch, appointed days into Lincoln's second term and held over by several presidents, led to the retirement of millions of dollars in greenbacks over the next several years in order to combat inflation and return the country to a gold standard. The 1860s statistics for the purchase of discount bills in England happens to correspond with the financing of the American Civil War. All from right there in London. May 10, 1866 saw the collapse and bankruptcy of Overend, Gurney and Company in London, the wholesale bankers' bank, which triggered the Panic of 1866, an international financial crisis that drove the working class to riot, demanding a fix to unemployment and low wages. Meanwhile, the Bank of England got to play its lender of last resort role for the first time. 2 days later, The Economist wrote that the panic indicated, quote, a state in which there is confidence in the Bank of England and in nothing but the Bank of England. Public confidence that the government is backing the bank then became their most important assets, as the same publications during the 1866 panic revealed to shaky investors for the first time that these bankers themselves did not consider the Bank of England to be a government agency. The 1867 Reform Act was meant to address these major issues surrounding labor and cool public rage. But I mean, come on. On Friday the 13th, 1866, the SS Great Eastern departed London, beginning the fifth attempt to lay an undersea transatlantic cable between Britain and North America, which was finally successful. On May 10, 1869, the first transcontinental railroad in the United States was completed at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. A ceremonial last spike made of gold was laid down on a special railroad tie made of California laurel. In September 1872, an International Arbitration Commission ordered Britain to pay the United States $15.5 million in damages. Britain, for its part, said it regretted aiding the Confederate commerce raiders during the Civil War.
We should point out that the 14th Amendment of July 1868, which famously underscores the citizenship and civil rights for emancipated former slaves and everyone else, very important, due process, equal protection, etc., also in the same amendment, but a separate and mostly unrelated clause in Section 4, deals with debts, confirming the, quote, validity of the public debt as appropriated by Congress officially, and reciprocally that the U.S. government would not be liable for any losses or debts connected with the loss of slaves, the debts of the Confederacy, etc., including as it relates to the lending role of British and French banks whose support for the Southern cause would result in financial debt losses. It reads in part, quote, "Neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States," end quote. So the federal government essentially compelled the southern states to repudiate their war debts, keeping the burden off of the federal government in the reconciled national character, in the reconciled nation. And meanwhile, the post-Civil War period saw the bitter era of Reconstruction, the rebuilding of the Southern economy under explicit martial law occupation, i.e. troops in the streets enforcing order as instituted at the federal level, all while plenty of financial shenanigans and rampant speculation was taking place by so-called carpetbaggers from the North and, of course, from Europe as well. This period of Reconstruction lasted until 1877, when federal troops were withdrawn. This same year, leaders in southern states again repudiated debts, now for the third time in U.S. history. Debts, they alleged, were issued during the Reconstruction period under illicit terms, for fraudulent purposes, and in the spirit of political corruption. You see, come 1909, the 16th Amendment was ratified, establishing Congress's authority to levy an income tax without being apportioned among states as based on population, or really without any major provisos. It was a reform, it was a follow-up to the 1861 Revenue Act, the national taxing powers of which were repealed after the war in 1872, once again regained under a very powerful central government. In 1872, he began his, quote, relentless march towards supremacy in oil, end quote, the annus mirabilis for John D. Rockefeller, the year he made his first million at age 33, leading Standard Oil to buy up 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries in what was dubbed the Cleveland Massacre. It eventuated in the company's control of over 90% of the oil industry, and Rockefeller's ascendancy as the first, quote, billionaire by 1916, even if it was really only 900 million. Unimaginable wealth grew up around the, quote, Mephistopheles of Cleveland. On the heels of fresh recapitalization in January 1872, Rockefeller launched a scheme that a congressional committee identified only a few months later as, quote, the most gigantic and daring conspiracy ever to confront a free nation, end quote, and was widely viewed, as author Ron Chernow notes, as a dress rehearsal for his master takeover scheme to be implemented in, quote, 1,000 secret, disguised, and indirect ways. Looking back on the oil wars of 1872, when Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and the entity then known as the Southern Improvement Company strong-armed his competitors into capitulating to his buyout or perishing under the crush of his boot. In this twisted, alternate take on Franklin's join or die colonial motto, John D. Rockefeller insisted that his ruthless buy-up of oil refineries and manipulation of the railroad transportation crucial to distribution was not the conspiracy of a pernicious cartel aiming to control the entire monopoly board, but a mission from God to save the oil business from confusion, disarray, and an existential threat where uncertainty would undermine all who were outside the safety net that Standard Oil offered through a unified market, controlled, of course, at the top of a vast combine, tweaking every factor from the oil barrel to the refinery to the railroads and consumer markets, at that time heavily oriented around kerosene illumination. But there was a light beyond that drew Rockefeller forward, and he cared not who failed to see his vision. His detractors and competitors were irrelevant, if not going extinct. Nowadays, most people imagine that American businessmen have always favored free competition, at least in the abstract. But in the industrial boom after the Civil War, the most significant revolt against free capitalism came not from reformers or zealous ideologues, but from businessmen who couldn't control the maddening fluctuations in the marketplace. In an unregulated economy, They had to improvise rules of the game as they went along. Pestered by overproduction in the early oil industry, Rockefeller tirelessly mocked those academic enthusiasts and sentimentalists who expected business to conform to their tidy competitive models. Like some of his contemporaries, he didn't see how they could build vast, enduring industries in a volatile economy disrupted by recessions, deflation, and explosive boom and bust cycles. And he decided to subjugate markets instead of responding endlessly to their changing price signals. Thus, Rockefeller and other industrial captains conspired to kill competitive capitalism in favor of a new monopoly capitalism. As Rockefeller's story shows, many of the age's most controversial business practices were forged in a desperate spirit of self-preservation. It was forced upon us, said Rockefeller of Standard Oil's genesis. We had to do it in self-defense. The oil business was in confusion and daily growing worse. Someone had to make a stand. Though he foresaw the triumph of cooperation, its far-ranging ramifications weren't yet clear to him. Quote, "This movement was the origin of the whole system of economic administration. It has revolutionized the way of doing business all over the world. The time was ripe for it. It had come, though all we saw at the moment was the need to save ourselves from wasteful conditions." End quote. Then, he added, as if enunciating his economic credo, "The day of combination is here to stay. Individualism has gone, never to return."
Part 5. The Coinage Act of 1873 demonetized the use of silver for making dollar coins in the U.S., which contributed to the Panic of 1873, which ensued after what is by now the usual, speculation and overexpansion. European investors who had been buying railroad bonds suddenly dumped them en masse, setting off a financial depression in both America and Europe so severe that it not only lasted 5 years, but was then infamously known as the Great Depression. That is, of course, until subsequent events were so sucky they stole the name. In 1875 and 76, the Rothschilds played a leading role in buying up shares from the Khedive government in Egypt under a £20 million loan to the British government in order to secure a controlling stake in the Suez Canal, and in turn safeguard their trade route to India. Shortly afterwards, the very leaders who sold their shares were deposed, and a government more friendly to Europe was installed. In 1881, the United States questioned the Bank of England about any holdings it had in Confederate assets. Speculation on defunct Confederate bonds began after rumors circulated claiming that over £1 million in gold still remained deposited in Bank of England vaults to float Confederate credit. Estimates of the alleged gold reserves ranged from 800,000 to 10 million, or even more, but the bank denied the existence of any amount in Confederate accounts altogether. On July 2, 1881, President James A. Garfield was fatally shot during an appearance at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. Though it took another 79 days for him to pass away on September 19th when he succumbed to infection. In the fall of 1881, newspapers ridiculed and attempted to dispel persistent rumors of lost Confederate treasure as mere myth, and particularly in regards to deposits in the Bank of England, allegedly still gaining interest. Claims that ex-president of the Confederacy Jefferson Davis stole $2.5 million in gold were probed, but countered by accounts of millions transferred from a train out of Richmond, Virginia to wagons headed beyond the Mississippi, which were then plundered by demoralized men accompanying the wagons after news of defeat, who then divided up the gold and treasure, with a few making off with just enough to bury, plot, and scheme over. Though widely discussed at the time, none of this is officially admitted. And it would officially go down in history as a myth. Meanwhile, yet another panic struck again, with the Panic of 1884, submerging people into yet another years-long depression. And what's more, their 80s music had no synthesizer. As usual, the depression resulted from bankers being dicks, specifically due to depleted gold reserves in Europe. Too bad they couldn't find all that Confederate gold. What was by then called the Crime of '73 drove populist demand for silver coinage, with the hope of raising prices for farmers and expanding economic influence outside of the Northeast, where gold interests were strongest. This movement culminated in the Free Silver Movement, which gained momentum over the next few decades. By 1890, the compromised Sherman Silver Purchase Act mandated the Treasury's purchase of 4.5 million ounces of silver per month, and allowed greenbacks to be redeemable in either gold or silver. Meanwhile, the insolvency of the Barings Bank in London triggered the Panic of 1890.
Oh, not again.
Plunging Argentina into crisis and threatening to crash the entire British banking system, which was ultimately saved after the Rothschilds and the Bank of England guaranteed Barings' debts.
Yet as the Barings Bank delved more and more into financial affairs throughout the Americas, it grew insolvent. Troubles in Argentina, which Barings was underwriting, led to severe losses, which in turn triggered the Panic of 1890. Overextended in speculation with lopsided balance sheets, the Barings carried near total holdings of the government securities, not only of Argentina, but Russia as well. Crisis became certain once a nervous Russian crown issued the order to pull out their sums, which proved greater than even this premier Anglo-American financial house had on hand. The governor of the Bank of England, inextricably connected with the movements of the Rothschild house, made the decision to save the Barings from oblivion and the city of London itself from a panic of unparalleled dimensions. However, there was an element of hesitation and reluctance for the Rothschilds to intervene on behalf of their rivals at Barings. It was not a matter of enmity, even though there was undoubtedly some personal and professional rivalry between Rothschild and Revelstoke, i.e. the Barings. Not that so much as a genuine dismay at the extent of the bank's insolvency, end quote. In the guise of rescue, Natty Rothschild used his influence to organize a bailout of Barings that would, simultaneously, solidify the Rothschilds' own dominance while subduing that of the Barings brothers. According to Niall Ferguson, Natty told a counterpart contemptuously that the Barings were finished and might prefer to cut up their remaining capital and retire into the country on 4% a year each, i.e. go the F away. As Niall Ferguson wrote in the House of Rothschild, quote, "The danger was that their losses were so great as to threaten a catastrophe, which would put an end to the commercial habit of transacting all business of the world by bills on London." Natty subsequently made a similar point, saying if Barings had been allowed to collapse, most of the general London houses would have fallen with them. His apparent conclusion was that nothing but government intervention could avert a crisis greater than even that of 1866. Thereafter, the Rothschilds consented to a consortium of banks organized under Bank of England leadership, a plan quite recognizable in modern times as well. As Ferguson again noted, quote, "The English houses perfectly understand their responsibility, and by preventing the catastrophe threatening the House of Baring, they are acting in their own self-interest, inasmuch as the House of Baring just now is the keystone of English commercial credit. The downfall of this house would bring forth a terrific calamity for English commerce all over the world," end quote. In the end, Barings was bailed out by the banks organized under the Bank of England, a familiar echo of things to come, a pattern of troubles and bailouts with no foreseeable end. Barings survived as an institution, but was never again the dominant force in London finance that it had been for more than a century, and particularly in the bankrolling of New World expansion. Natty Rothschild, on the other hand, enhanced his status within the official circles of England's banking system, and prevailed in their game of imperial finance for some time to come. As Ferguson wrote, what happened in 1890 was that a bank, which, according to the formal rules of the financial market, should have failed, was bailed out by a collective intervention initiated by the Bank of England, underwritten at the critical juncture by the government, and paid for by a broad coalition of other city houses under the leadership of Curry and Rothschild.
Shortly after, the Panic of 1893 resulted from a run on gold reserves in the U.S., which was used to pay for silver bullion purchased by the Treasury. Subsequently, the Silver Purchase Act was repealed, prices and wages fell, and economic depression became the major backdrop of the upcoming 1896 election, with the aptly named Panic of 1896. Because by that point, they were just having these panics like every so many years. It was just the panic of this year, and then a few good years, and then another panic, and then a few good years, and another panic. Wash, rinse, repeat. The Panic of 1896, however, added further fuel to the debates over gold and silver as currency. Oh, forgot to mention hearings in the Congressional Banking Committee of 1894 attempted to absolve all liability. Because, of course. On July 9, 1896, presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan gave his famous Cross of Gold speech in favor of free silver coinage at the Democratic National Convention. His populist rhetoric appealed to farmers and ordinary people who for years believed that silver was the sword that would cut the Gordian knot of privilege.
If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold stamp by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
Despite winning 22 states, Bryan lost to McKinley, who won 23, and dominated the Electoral College votes. Between 1898 and 1902, President McKinley oversaw the Spanish-American War in Cuba and then the U.S.-Philippine War, pushing America fully into imperialism. McKinley was reelected in 1900, but then assassinated, dying a week after being shot at the Pan American International Expo in Buffalo on September 6, 1901, by a supposed anarchist. Vice President Teddy Roosevelt inherited the presidency. But Teddy Roosevelt, too, would preside over panic with the Panic of 1901.
No freaking way.
I mean, how many years did you really think we were going to go into the 20th century without another panic? I mean, we haven't mentioned one for at least, like 2 minutes. So, the Panic of 1901 was also known as the Rich Man's Panic, which involved a fight to control the Northern Pacific Railway among several famous rich investors and triggered the first ever stock market crash on the New York Stock Exchange, followed by a recession. Part 6. Part 6 kicks off with the April 18, 1906 San Francisco earthquake, a devastating 7.9 magnitude earthquake that killed over 3,000 people and destroyed 80% of the city, and equated to more than 1% of gross national product in damages. Foreign insurers pulled their claims, the Bank of England shunned U.S. finance bills, and the U.S. dove into depression, which set us all up for, let's all say it together, the Panic of 1907. What started as an attempt by relatively small players to corner the copper market morphed into bank runs at national banks and then trust companies. With its deposits threatened, the Knickerbocker Trust requested help from J.P. Morgan, but was turned down and was forced to suspend operations. This in turn fueled crisis of mistrust throughout New York. At that point, Morgan reversed his decision and extended financial aid to struggling trust companies, but even this was not enough to avert further crisis and stop the runs. Credit tightened severely, and the call money interest rate soared from 9.5% to a staggering and unprecedented 70%, and then to the completely ridiculous 100%. Loans became extremely hard to come by, and the entire New York financial system nearly ground to a halt. However, J.P. Morgan pulled together enough cash to keep loans going and keep the New York Stock Exchange open. The New York Clearing House then temporarily increased its liquidity, while gold imports helped to restore calm and stabilize the system. The technical nature of the crisis, with trust companies outside of the clearinghouse lender of last resort system, prompted banking reforms and policy inside the yet-to-be Federal Reserve System. On December 16, 1907, an annual report issued by Comptroller of the Currency William Barrett Ridgely recommended to Washington the establishment by the government of a central bank of issue and reserve. That's right, on the 134th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party.
This was in 1907. But with all the mistakes, all the human weaknesses of 1907, progress kept on.
In 1908, the Aldrich-Vreeland Act instituted an emergency currency to be issued during crisis, but its real purpose was to provide a long-term solution. It established the National Monetary Commission to recommend reforms. Its chairman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, sent a team of experts to European capitals to study their central banking systems, and another team to study the existing American monetary system in detail. However, though the public widely supported banking reforms, many, including progressives like William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson, were skeptical of the great power vested in central banks run by private interests, and wanted a bank in the public interest with diffused power. Senator Aldrich himself, who was closely linked to J.P. Morgan and whose own daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr., was somehow seen as having a dangerous conflict of interest. Then, in the last 10 days of November 1910, a secret gathering of top moneymen was formed at Jekyll Island, Georgia, in order to work out the details of the scheme for America's money system, which was to be managed by private shareholders. What would become the U.S. Federal Reserve? The retreat included leading representatives from New York banks, the J.P. Morgan Company, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and representatives of the Rockefeller and Rothschild interests, as well as Colonel Edward House, who would soon become future President Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor.
Jekyll Island was named in honor of Sir Joseph Jekyll, circa 1733, after the British barrister who provided £600 to British soldier James Oglethorpe to fund the colony of Georgia. More than a century later, America's second-to-last known slave ship, the Wanderer, illegally brought a shipment of some 500 kidnapped and enslaved Africans to none other than Jekyll Island on November 28, 1858. Just a few years before the Civil War began. By the 1880s, Jekyll Island was a very exclusive hangout for America's wealthy elite. In 1886, the island was purchased by the Jekyll Island Club, referred to in Munsey's magazine as, quote, the richest, the most exclusive, and the most inaccessible club in the world. The club officially opened in 1888 and has been described many times as a retreat for families who, in total, represented a sixth of the world's wealth at the time. Names like Morgan, Vanderbilt, and Pulitzer are intimately tied to it, and the name Rockefeller still graces the mansion-size cottage which houses the island's museum today. Technology, too, had its milestones at Jekyll, as the first transcontinental phone call also just so happened to connect with Jekyll Island. The story goes that AT&T president Theodore Vail, who had a home on Jekyll, had hurt his leg and couldn't leave the island, so an extra 1,100 miles of copper wire had to be laid to allow Vail to participate in the call to the White House, which he did from a parlor in Jekyll Island Club as J.P. Morgan Jr. and William Rockefeller hung out nearby.
Participant Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank in New York, recalled the air of secrecy in his autobiography.
There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed, as furtive as any conspirator. We were trying to plan a mechanism that would correct the weakness of our banking system, as revealed under the strains and pressures of the Panic of 1907. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had gotten together and writing a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress.
Now spend your money, never done. Spend your money, ha ha. Spend your money, gonna never done. Now spend your money. Oh, spend your money, gonna never done. Spend your... Grate your potato. Ah, grate your potato. Put a little piece of pumpkin in it, gonna make it yellow. Love, girl, love. Love, girl, love. Love, girl, love, girl. Spend your money. Ah! Spend your money, never done. Spend. Oh, mama, gonna spend your money, gonna never done. I know you like it. Oh, money gonna never done. Spend your money. I went down to town the other day. Spend your money. I see all them boys getting bouncy. Now spend your money. What I call my money, get $5 go on the trip. Now spend your money. Oh, mama gonna, mama gonna spend your money. Love, God, love. Love, God, love. Love, God, love, God, spend. Oh, spend your money, gonna never done. Oh, you're going too narrow. You're going too narrow. Oh, you put 1/2 yard in, it's gonna make it wider. Oh, spend your money, gonna never done. Spend the money. Oh, mama, gonna spend your money, gonna. la nini, la 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 da 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 do be da do do da do da la do deep la do la do it la do la do la do oh mama, oh spend your money, spend your money, on spend your money now. Spend your money, now spend your money now. Done. Love, God, love, love, God, love. Oh, love, God, spend your. I spend your money, gone now. Done. Oh, spend your money, gone now. Done. Oh, spend your money, gone now. Done. Oh, grate your potato, grate your potato. Put a little piece of pumpkin in it, gonna make it yellow. Oh, spend your money, gonna now a done. Hey, la, 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 la. I'm going, Lord, 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 Lord. La, da, 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 da. Spend your money, now a done. Spend your money.